Chapter 35, American World War II, 1941 and 1945. Let's get started. With some key points. First of all, World War II is the permanent end to American isolationism. Never again can we stay out of major foreign affairs, major world events. Also, American manufacturing and military efforts will play a very significant role in the Allied victory. Atomic weapons will be used for the first time. And the government will be playing a very large role in the wartime economy, much like it did during the First World War. And again, it will sort of turn that over to the private sector afterwards. You can see Churchill and Roosevelt in the bottom right-hand corner there. The two of them seem to have had a real, genuine friendship. They certainly cooperated very well against the Axis powers. But the two of them did agree on this ABC-1 agreement, and basically it just said that the United States and Britain would first focus their efforts on Germany, and then the Allies would then turn their attention to Japan. So the United States didn't neglect Japan, but the focus of the war machine will be in Europe and Africa, for that matter. Now, the United States, again, had a lot of space to their advantage. They are geographically isolated. They have two oceans to protect them. Obviously, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, but even that with Hawaii is quite far from the west coast of the continental United States. So we have a lot of time, and with that time, we need to feed and clothe and transport all of our men and material to various places around the world, and that involves a transition of the economy. We start to produce war supplies and stop producing consumer goods. Take this Model A, for example. You can see here what a beautiful car in front of a beautiful home, obviously. It's a Ford. Well, during the war, Ford did not make cars like this. Instead, plants such as the Willow Run plant in Michigan started to produce these B-24 Liberator planes, and production was so high that one of these rolled off the production line every 63 minutes. Thank you, Ken Burns. There's a great deal of unity after the attack at Pearl Harbor. The Pageant tells us that immigrants were more likely to assimilate into American society very quickly than they were previously. Certainly during the First World War, we saw a lot of targeting of European immigrant groups. That just doesn't happen in the early 1940s. Of course, there's the exception of the Japanese, and the United States government issues Executive Order number 9066. In which Japanese American citizens, roughly 110,000 of them, were actually placed into internment camps, specifically on the West Coast. The fear was that they might be spies or might be trying to sabotage the American war effort or aid the Japanese in some sort of an invasion. But obviously, this is a restriction of rights against American citizens, and it's not okay. But the Supreme Court did uphold this in 1944 in the court case Korematsu versus the U.S. The federal government does, at this time, sort of end its New Deal efforts, and with that, I would say there's no real progressive goals that we may have seen during the New Deal. Really, the focus is on the wartime economy and the transition of the economy to a wartime economy. Here's a photo of some Japanese children inside one of these internment camps. Similar as to the First World War, we have a War Production Board, which will oversee war production, and it does end non-essential items, such as that Model A I showed you before, and instead switches over or begins the retooling process within these factories to produce wartime goods. The government actually imposed a national speed limit and gasoline rationing after America's supply of natural rubber from British Malaysia and the Dutch East Indies was broken. And in addition to just industries such as that, there's just a general scarcity of consumer goods. And as the supply of consumer goods goes down, obviously the price goes up. So there's some inflation that occurs beginning in 1942. The Office of Price Administration is going to be created to try to stabilize prices, to curb inflation, as it says there. Okay, so the War Labor Board during the Second World War, as you can see, does impose ceilings on wage increases, so it basically caps how high wages can go, and labor unions are not going to be thrilled with that, obviously. Some leaders, such as John L. Lewis, seen in the top right-hand corner, they're actually encouraged labor unions to go on strike. Now, during a wartime economy, the goal of the federal government is to maintain production, so strikes need to be addressed, and in fact, in 1943, Congress passed the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, which said that the federal government could operate industries that were under strike, such as coal mines or railroads. Again, make sure that production is maintained. That is the goal of Uncle Sam in a wartime economy. So despite the fact that many industrial and agricultural workers were exempt from the draft, this boom in the wartime economy does lead to a demand for labor. And in 1942, the Bracero program was created to help alleviate that demand. Thousands of Mexican agricultural workers were brought to the U.S. to harvest the farms of the West. Incidentally, during the Great Depression, thousands of Mexican agricultural workers were deported as there was a decrease in demand for labor in that sector. Nearly 216,000 women served in World War II in various auxiliary corps. You can see some of them here with the Army and the Navy and the Coast Guard versions of that. These are non-combative but supportive roles. And of course, there is the famed Rosie the Riveter, who took up jobs in factories in these wartime industries. Although most women, it said in the text, did continue their traditional household roles. Here is a poster for the WAAC. This is My War Too. Again, sort of encouraging, it's propaganda for sure, but certainly encouraging that contribution and participation amongst women in the country. And please note that this is sort of a global phenomenon as well, that it happens outside the United States. Here is the image of Rosie the Riveter that I think most people today would recognize, but there were others as well, including this cover of the Saturday Evening Post done by Norman Rockwell. And here's a real-life Rosie operating a lathe. Many African Americans will also seek employment in the defense industry in the North, and that migration will result in increased racial tensions. As a result of demands for equal equality for African Americans, Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which forbade discrimination in the defense industries. In 1944, we have the introduction of the mechanical cotton picker, which ended the need for cheap labor in the South. Similar to the cotton gin we talked about earlier this year, it greatly increased production and decreased the amount of people that were needed to produce that quantity. The section also talks about thousands of Native Americans that served in the armed forces, and two tribes in particular were used for code talking. And so Comanches were used in Europe and Navajos in the Pacific. And these men, what they would do is they would transmit messages over the radio in their native language. And within that, it would also sort of be coded. So they might use the word bird, the Navajo word for bird, to refer to a plane. Now, what I know is that virtually nobody outside of the world of academics in the United States and those particular tribes actually spoke those languages. So these men could communicate openly and freely over the airwaves, and the enemy would have no idea what they were talking about. Here's a graph to show you the decline in the population that lived in the South of African Americans, and you can see that it is fairly steady until roughly 1940. We start to see that dramatic decline. And this graph here, this map, shows sort of the percentage increase in various cities. And you can see a similarity here with the first Great Migration during the First World War and the Second Great Migration during the Second World War here in terms of where people are moving to. But you see some significant increases here, over 10% increase in the major northeastern cities of the African American population. Again, with the trends similar to World War I, we see this real effort on the home front to sort of fight the war as a civilian. What could you do to contribute to it? And part of that support might be because the United States is geographically isolated. They're not really going to be physically damaged by the war, and they experience some very strong economic growth. Gross national product and the average citizen's disposable income had increased significantly. Now, the federal government is much more involved in the individual citizens' lives during World War II. Rationing, for example, did restrict what you could buy. And the national debt will increase significantly, as you can see here, from $49 billion to $259 billion, as most of the war costs were actually borrowed. So a continuation of that Keynesian approach, that deficit spending that we saw with Roosevelt and the New Deal. Simultaneously with the assault on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched attacks on various Far Eastern strongholds, including the American outposts of Guam, the Wake Islands, and the Philippines. Now, in the Philippines, American forces, are led by General MacArthur, held out against the invading Japanese force for about 5 months. MacArthur eventually left, and the American troops had to surrender on April 9, 1942. Following that, they were treated with a vicious, cruel 80-mile death march, the Bataan Death March, to a prisoner of war camp. By May 6, 1942, the Japanese had complete control of the Philippines. Here's MacArthur here. We'll see him again in the Korean War. And here's an image from the Bataan Death March. Again, raising concerns about sort of like what is okay in wartime, humanitarian concerns about what should not be done during war. Talk about a couple of naval battles here. Coral Sea, which is sort of the high water mark for the Japanese, and then Midway, which is the turning point. In May of 1942, the American carrier fleet, with some Australian support, was able to defeat the Japanese carrier fleet. And for the first time now, a naval battle was fought entirely between aircraft carriers. The carriers never fired upon each other directly. Planes carried out the fighting. Just a month later here, you can see the Battle of Midway is the turning point. And fortunately for the United States, they were able to decode these Japanese messages and actually pinpoint sort of where this was going to happen. And that gave the United States a significant advantage. And had the Japanese been victorious at Midway, then they would have been able to launch attacks directly against Pearl Harbor. So Chester Nimitz is going to receive quite a bit of fame for this. Here's a carrier. You can see the planes in formation. And here is where Midway is. Again, you can see it's relatively close to Hawaii. And as I said, Nimitz is going to be sort of championed here as a strategist. Now, I've shown you a map already, and I'll show it to you again, but the Japanese expansion in the Pacific was quite significant, and obviously there is a tremendous amount of small islands. And so the United States adopts this policy of island hopping or leapfrogging over various islands, and instead targeting specific places that could be of good use. The overall goal of the Americans was to protect the shipping lanes, as you can see, and move closer to the mainland Japan, so we could keep the flow of goods and war supplies, and also sort of have a place to launch our eventual attack against Japan. In August 1942 to 43, the Americans fight for control of Guadakanal, which is near Australia. And the casualty ratio, was very high, as you can see, in terms of Japanese to Americans. And this raises concerns later on, and in fact encourages the use of the atomic bombs, as the belief was that the Japanese just simply would not surrender. Again, with Admiral Nimitz, he successfully coordinated naval, air, and ground assaults in the Pacific. It's really amphibious, as again we were attacking islands. And you can see here, with victories at the Saipan Island, Tinian Island, and the major islands of the Marianas in August 1944, that the U.S. could now launch round-trip bombing raids on Japan's home islands. And so here's that map I showed you last chapter, just to give you an idea of how sparse these islands are in terms of where they are and how far apart they are. And I've been on a big headline kick, so here's a headline of American planes bombing Tokyo. Another similarity to the First World War, the United States Navy will be involved in escorting war supplies across the Atlantic as German submarines were preying upon these merchant vessels. They used this new wolf pack technique in which a large group of submarines would sort of gang up on merchant vessels. The Allies were able to use air patrols and radar to help win that battle. 1942, we have the turning point in the land-air war against Hitler at the Battle of El Alamein. British General Bernard Montgomery defeated the Germans, who were led by Marshal Erwin Rommel. And on the Eastern Front, September 1942, the Soviets were able to repel Hitler's attack at Stalingrad, and this is the turning point in the war with the Soviet Union as well. So FDR wanted to attack the Western Front, sort of in France now, to give the Soviets some breathing room, and I think that Joseph Stalin was pretty adamant that that should happen. British military planners preferred to attack Hitler through the soft underbelly of the Mediterranean, and the Americans will agree to that. Dwight D. Eisenhower will be given control of the assault, and this is going to be the mightiest waterborne effort up to that time in history. and it was successful. The German-Italian army, or a large German-Italian army, surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943. Here you can see sort of where those attacks were coming from and the difficulty of crossing a channel like that in force, in mass, must have been large. But again, with this amphibious sort of approach. Here's Eisenhower. And here is a tree that was named for Eisenhower. It was a loblolly pine. And I will give one bonus point on the upcoming test to the first student who can tell me on what course this tree used to be located. It actually is no longer there, unfortunately, but it was named for Eisenhower because he apparently hooked his tee shot into it quite regularly, and he lobbied the course to have it removed. They said no. Now, at Casablanca, President Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill in January of 1943, and the two agreed to step up the war in the Pacific, invade Sicily, and increase pressure on Italy. But they also agreed to insist upon this unconditional surrender of the enemy. And the Allied forces will be successful in capturing Sicily of 1943 as Italy surrendered unconditionally. Mussolini was overthrown, but the Germans continued to fight for control of Italy, and it wasn't until June 4th, 1944, that Rome was taken. Now, the Allied efforts in Italy did divert some German troops away from the Soviet and French fronts, but it also delayed the Allied invasion of Normandy, which will occur several months later. And this gave the Soviets more time to take territory in Eastern Europe. This idea of unconditional surrender, though, will come back, specifically with the Japanese, as I said earlier. Okay, the pageant tells us that Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Tehran late in 1943 to coordinate a second front, and again, Eisenhower will be given command of this. French Normandy was chosen as the point for the invasion, as it was less heavily defended. In fact, it was not the most logical choice, and so there's a diversionary tactic about that as well. And the Allies did make a real effort to try to fool the Germans into thinking that the attack was going to come someplace else. June 6, 1944 is, of course, D-Day, and that is the day that the invasion began. Now, the Allies broke through the German beach defenses, which were heavily defended, and following that, command was given to General George S. Patton to lead an armored division across France. Paris was eventually liberated by August of 1944. And here's a map of these beachheads: Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. There where the American forces were concentrated. I actually have some sand from those beaches that was brought to me by a student, so please remind me to show them to you in class, should I forget. Now, obviously, we are fighting World War II, at least partially, to end dictatorship and oppression and tyranny, and many people will start to criticize FDR as he runs again for a fourth term against this man here, Thomas Dewey. Dewey had this isolationist Senator John W. Bricker as a vice presidential candidate, and FDR would have Harry Truman as his vice presidential candidate, who, of course, will make a very significant decision towards the end of the war. Now, Roosevelt wins, and he probably won because things were going well with the war. Keep in mind that, and I think I said this in class, that we have legit presidential elections throughout the Great Depression, the New Deal era there, and World War II. And you can see that as Roosevelt's support does decrease over those times. I think the high water mark would be 1936, where just about everybody voted for Roosevelt. But in 1940 and 44, that vote actually decreases. So the American public believed that we needed experience, and especially in terms of making peace after the war, and Roosevelt was overwhelmingly the choice. Look at the electoral vote. You can see he did have 81%, but the popular vote is much closer, only 3 million votes to separate them. All right, December 1944, Hitler threw all of his forces against the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes Forest, and these German divisions were able to break through the line, creating a bulge in the line, hence the name, the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, the 101st Airborne Division was able to sort of stop the German push. Eventually, they did receive some support and relief from American armored divisions. In 1945, American troops continued into Germany and began discovering the concentration camps. Again, as I said last chapter, I think people knew about anti-Semitism in Europe, and they had an idea about sort of the relocation of Jews, but the actual extent of the Holocaust was something that was not really known until later on. The Soviets did capture Berlin in April of 1945, and Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. April 12th, 1945, FDR also died suddenly. He had a massive brain hemorrhage, and his vice president, Harry Truman, will replace him and serve as president for the remainder of the war. May 7th, though, 1945, the U.S. received the unconditional surrender from Germany, and May 8th was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe. And again, people rejoiced. The war's only half over, or two-thirds over, though, right? We do have the Japanese still left on the table. And here is Churchill and Britain, victory. All right, so as I said earlier, the Allies began bombing Tokyo as soon as they could, and they used traditional fire bombs to kill over 83,000 people, which does rival the amount of casualties from each of the atomic bombs, but it'll be some time before those are used. MacArthur will return to the Philippines to recapture the Philippines in force, as you can see here, in the 3 battles in Lake Gulf, which did mark the end of Japan's sea power. There are 2 island battles that we should draw our attention to, the first of which is Iwo Jima, captured in March 1945, which would have been a nice air base. This is the only island battle where American casualties outnumbered Japanese casualties, with roughly 25,000 casualties. Okinawa, on the other hand, the Japanese suffered over 100,000 casualties, and they used kamikaze, suicide Japanese pilots to attack American ships. And so this really contributed to that push to use atomic bombs, as people began to say that the Japanese just certainly were not going to surrender. They certainly were not going to surrender unconditionally. Here's the famed raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. And just so you can see the proximity here of Okinawa to Japan, it's quite close. As I said before, the belief was that Japan was not going to surrender, and they certainly were not going to surrender unconditionally. And at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, Truman met with Stalin and the British leaders, both Churchill and a man named Clement Attlee. They were both there. And they issued an ultimatum to Japan, which was simple: surrender or be destroyed. The United States had developed the atomic bomb with their Manhattan Project, and they actually detonated a test bomb in July 16, 1945, as well. Now, when the Japanese refused to surrender after that, the United States dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, killing 180,000 people on August 6. Now, just after that, Stalin began to invade the Japanese defense in Manchuria and Korea, and many people argue that the U.S. fired this second bomb to end the war before the Soviets could play a significant role in defeating the Japanese, to therefore give us more leverage at the bargaining table. For whatever reason, on August 9th, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, which killed 80,000 people. On August 10th, 1945, Tokyo surrendered. It was almost unconditional. They had one condition, and that was that Emperor Hirohito would be allowed to keep his title as emperor, and the United States and the Allies agreed to that. And on September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day was declared, victory in Japan. Here are those 2 atomic bombs, codenamed Little Boy and Fat Man. And of course, the mushroom cloud that accompanies those. As I said with the key points, American military efforts were far larger in World War II than they were in World War I, and as a result of that, we did suffer 1 million casualties. Now, pay note that the Soviets suffered almost 25 million casualties, and so there's a discrepancy there, of course. After the war, much of the world was destroyed, with the exception of the United States, again, who experienced continued economic growth. And time and foresight to prepare made the U.S. more prepared than other nations for the war. Again, as I said with the key points, they had that geographic isolation. Wow, that's it for Chapter 35 in World War II. It is hard to believe we only have 7 more chapters to go. The end is in sight. It's kind of bittersweet. Anyone else a little sad? I'm not sure. Maybe you are. But if you have any questions about Chapter 35 or anything else, please feel free to email me or just let me know in class. Take care.